I think we should start with this map. This map shows military strikes across the Middle East over the past months. Red markers are missile launches. Blue markers are airstrikes. They are concentrated around one country, Iran. But the aircraft launching many of those strikes belong to two other countries, Israel and the United States. This map explains why the region is suddenly on the brink of a much larger war.
The United States and Israel are intensifying their bombing of Iran.
We gotta finish the job, right?
All of this raises a question. Why are these countries attacking each other now? Because for decades, this conflict existed mostly in the shadows. But now it's happening in the open. To understand what we're seeing today, we have to go back to where this rivalry began. Before 1979, things looked very different. For much of the Cold War, Iran occupied a central place in the strategic architecture of the United States in the Middle East. Under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who ruled from 1941 until 1979, Iran positioned itself as a firmly pro-Western monarchy. Washington viewed Iran as a crucial bulwark against Soviet expansion toward the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. This strategic partnership deepened, particularly after the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat, when the CIA and British intelligence supported the overthrow of Iran's elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, following his attempt to nationalize the country's oil industry. The coup had two long-term consequences. First, it reinforced the Shah's dependence on American political and military backing. Second, it embedded in Iranian political consciousness the perception that the United States was willing to intervene directly in Iranian domestic affairs to protect its strategic and economic interests. For decades afterward, this episode served as a foundational grievance for revolutionary leaders and remains a central reference point in Iranian political discourse. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Iran became one of the largest recipients of American military assistance in the developing world. The Shah pursued an ambitious modernization project, often referred to as the White Revolution, which aimed to transform Iran into a technologically advanced regional power. In doing so, he relied heavily on Western investment, American weapon systems, and security cooperation with Washington. During this same period, Iran also maintained discreet but significant ties with Israel. Although Iran never formally recognized Israel in diplomatic terms, the two states developed a pragmatic relationship grounded in shared strategic concerns. Both countries viewed the rise of Arab nationalist regimes, particularly under Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, as a potential threat to regional stability. This alignment was sometimes described by Israeli strategists as part of the periphery doctrine, which sought partnerships with non-Arab states on the margins of the Middle East, including Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia. Through intelligence cooperation, energy trade, and limited military coordination, Iran and Israel maintained a relationship that, while largely hidden from public view, was strategically meaningful. Thus, by the late 1970s, Iran functioned as a cornerstone of the Western security order in the Middle East and an indirect partner of Israel. Yet beneath this alignment, domestic tensions within Iran were intensifying. The Iranian Revolution fundamentally altered Iran's political identity and foreign policy orientation. A broad coalition of clerics, leftists, nationalists, and students mobilized against the Shah's regime, criticizing its authoritarian governance, economic inequality, and perceived subordination to Western interests. The revolution ultimately brought to power the clerical leadership of Ruhollah Khomeini, who articulated a radically different vision for Iran's role in global politics. Rather than integrating with Western institutions, the new Islamic Republic framed itself as a revolutionary state committed to resisting what it described as global imperialism. In this ideological framework, the United States became labeled the Great Satan, a symbol of external domination and moral corruption. Israel, meanwhile, was portrayed as a colonial outpost imposed upon the Middle East at the expense of Palestinians. These narratives were institutionalized within the political ideology of the Islamic Republic and embedded in its constitution and regional strategy. The revolutionary government's hostility toward Washington intensified almost immediately during the Iran hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981, when Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats for more than a year. This event severed diplomatic relations between Iran and the United States and caused mutual distrust, which persists to this day. Following the revolution, Iran's relationship with Israel and the United States evolved from strategic partnership to structural antagonism. Tehran increasingly positioned itself as the leader of what it termed the axis of resistance, supporting political and militant actors opposed to Israeli and American influence in the region. Among the most prominent of these allies is Hezbollah, a Lebanese movement formed in the early 1980s with Iranian support. For Israeli and American politicians, Iran's ideological hostility and its growing military capabilities, including missile development and a controversial nuclear program, have become a major strategic challenge. Over time, this led to a complex rivalry and settlement of sanctions pressures on Iran and periodic military confrontation. For most of the last 4 decades, the confrontation between Iran and Israel has not taken the form of direct military action. Instead, it unfolded in the form of a shadow war, a protracted conflict with no direct military operations. The central element of Iran's regional strategy has been the cultivation of non-state armed actors aligned with its geopolitical interests. Among the most prominent are Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Palestinian territories. These groups perform many functions at the same time. They act as deterrents against Israeli military actions, expand Iran's influence over the entire Levant, and allow Tehran to demonstrate its power. From Israel's perspective, this network of allied militias constitutes an immediate and persistent security threat. Rather than confronting Iran directly, which would risk large-scale regional escalation, Israel has historically relied on a doctrine of preventive and covert action. This has included targeted assassinations of individuals associated with Iran's military and nuclear programs. These interactions rarely escalate into open war, yet they form a continuous cycle of action and retaliation. Each side seeks to impose costs on the other while carefully avoiding a threshold that would trigger full-scale confrontation. The result is a conflict that is constant, but often invisible, highly active beneath the surface, even in periods that appear outwardly calm. In the early morning of February 28th, the armed forces of the United States and Israel launched a coordinated and unprecedented military campaign against Iran. Over the course of about 12 hours, more than 900 strikes were carried out against missile systems, air defense systems, command infrastructure, and key elements of Iran's political and military leadership. It wasn't just a limited operation. It was a determined attempt to deliver a fundamental, powerful blow to the Iranian regime and weaken Iran's military potential. One of the most significant results of the first strikes was the assassination of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. An attack on the head of state is one of the most extreme forms of escalation of this conflict. This meant a shift from containment to systemic destruction, an attempt not only to weaken Iran, but also to potentially destabilize its leadership structure. However, instead of collapsing, the system adapted. Immediately after the assassination of the supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei assumed a central leadership role, consolidating continuity amid the crisis. As the campaign unfolded, one of the most devastating and morally significant moments was the attack on an elementary school for girls in Manab, Hormozgan province. A rocket hit the Shijar Tayeb school during classes, and according to UN experts, it killed at least 165 girls, most of whom were between the ages of 7 and 12. Tehran's reaction was swift and decisive. Interrupting decades of mostly indirect confrontation, Iran has launched several series of ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles aimed at Israeli territory, US military installations in the Middle East, and critical infrastructure throughout the Persian Gulf. This marked a clear shift in doctrine. Iran no longer relied solely on proxies, but resorted to direct, undisguised retaliation to strengthen deterrence. As the military confrontation intensified, Iran opened a new front, one that extended far beyond the battlefield and into the foundations of the global economy. At the center of this escalation lies the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow maritime corridor through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and natural gas supplies pass every day. For decades, it has been recognized as one of the most critical chokepoints in the global energy system, a single point of failure with the power to disrupt entire economies. On March 2nd, Iranian officials declared the strait effectively closed. The message was unambiguous: any vessel attempting to cross could be treated as a target. Yet what followed was not a traditional naval blockade. Iran did not need to physically seal the waterway. Instead, it demonstrated how modern conflict can weaponize uncertainty. Through a limited number of drone strikes in and around the strait, Iran created an environment so volatile that insurers refused to cover commercial shipping. Without insurance, ships could not sail. Within days, one of the busiest shipping routes in the world fell nearly silent, not because it was physically impassable, but because it had become economically and operationally impossible to use. The consequences were immediate and global. oil prices surged sharply, rising from pre-war levels of around $65 per barrel to well above $100. Natural gas markets, particularly in Europe and Asia, experienced even steeper increases. For energy-dependent economies, the shock reverberated across supply chains, inflation, and industrial production. The disruption extended beyond transit. Countries like Iraq, unable to export oil through the strait, were forced to scale back production due to storage constraints. Meanwhile, infrastructure across the Gulf, including facilities linked to Saudi Aramco, came under threat, raising concerns that even alternative export routes might not remain viable. What emerged was not just a regional disruption, but the contours of a global energy crisis, one that some analysts compared to the oil shocks of the 1970s. Yet the closure of the strait was not absolute. In a move that reflects both strategic calculation and geopolitical signaling, Iran adopted a policy of selective passage. While vessels associated with the United States and its allies faced exclusion, ships from certain countries were granted limited access on a case-by-case basis. This transformed the strait from a neutral trade route into an instrument of political leverage. Countries such as India, Pakistan, and Turkey reportedly secured permission for individual vessels to pass. China, heavily dependent on Gulf energy supplies, entered negotiations with Tehran to ensure continued access. Meanwhile, European states, including France and Italy, sought diplomatic channels to protect their shipping interests. In response, US leadership proposed the formation of a multinational naval coalition to secure the strait and escort commercial vessels. Historically, similar measures had been used during the so-called tanker wars of the 1980s, but this time, the response was far more restrained. Key allies, including Germany, Greece, and the United Kingdom, signaled reluctance or outright refusal to participate in military operations. Their hesitation reflected both political opposition to the war itself and the practical difficulties of deploying naval forces into an active conflict zone. Even with offers of military escorts and state-backed insurance mechanisms, a fundamental reality remained unchanged. Shipping companies were not just calculating financial risk, but existential risk and the potential for environmental catastrophe in one of the world's most constrained waterways. In closing the Strait of Hormuz, Iran demonstrated that modern warfare is no longer confined to territory or direct military confrontation. By leveraging geography, market psychology, and global interdependence, it transformed a regional conflict into a systemic crisis. This was not simply an act of retaliation. It was a strategic escalation that blurred the line between war and economic disruption, showing that in an interconnected world, control over a narrow stretch of water can carry consequences as profound as any battlefield victory. And in doing so, it raised a new and unsettling question, not just how wars are fought, but how far their impact can reach.